What happens when a royal descendant emerges from obscurity to claim the throne they believe is rightfully theirs? This isn't just a plot from a historical drama. It's a real-life scenario that has played out time and again throughout history, filled with ambition, intrigue, and the high-stakes gamble of power. Imagine living your entire life in the shadows, knowing your bloodline carries the weight of crowns and kingdoms, only to step forward one day and declare yourself the true heir. These claimants didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were often backed by powerful allies, vast fortunes, and sometimes the sheer audacity to challenge established monarchies. Their stories are woven into the fabric of royal scandals, where legitimacy was questioned, alliances were tested, and the very notion of birthright could be overturned by a compelling story and the right connections. During the Gilded Age, a period marked by unprecedented wealth and social ambition, a new kind of player entered this royal drama: the American heiress. These women, often daughters of industrial tycoons and railroad magnates, possessed fortunes that could rival entire European treasuries. But money alone wasn't enough to buy their way into the highest echelons of society. They sought titles, prestige, and a place in the world of old-world aristocracy. What better way to secure that status than by backing a royal claimant? By financing these aspirants to thrones, these heiresses didn't just gain influence. They became central figures in some of the most sensational and scandalous episodes of the era. Their involvement added a fascinating layer to these historical power struggles, blending New World wealth with Old World ambition in ways that forever changed the course of many noble families. This video will take you on a journey through these extraordinary tales of ambition and aspiration. We'll explore the lives of those who believed the crown was their destiny and the wealthy benefactors who made those dreams possible. From whispered conspiracies in opulent drawing rooms to very public battles for recognition, these stories reveal the lengths people will go to rewrite their fate. You'll discover how personal ambition, combined with vast resources, could challenge centuries of tradition and even threaten the stability of nations. So settle in and prepare to step into a world where bloodlines and bank accounts collided, where the pursuit of a throne became the ultimate expression of human desire for legacy, power, and belonging. The truth behind these royal claims is more gripping than any fiction. At the heart of these dramatic struggles lies the compelling figure known as the pretender. This term itself is a fascinating piece of political language, often loaded with implication. In the strictest sense, a pretender is simply someone who asserts a claim to a title or office, particularly a throne, that is currently occupied by another. But the word rarely feels neutral. It often carries a whisper of doubt, suggesting ambition might be outstripping legitimacy. To truly understand their power, we need to distinguish between the different types of individuals who find themselves in this precarious position. First, you have the legitimate heir. This is someone whose claim, based on the established laws of succession, is widely recognized as valid. They might be living in exile because their family was overthrown, or they could be waiting in the wings as the next in line. Their claim is a matter of law and bloodline. Then there is the claimant. This person actively pursues their asserted right to the throne, often through legal petitions, public campaigns, or by gathering political and military support. Their claim may be strong or weak, but they are working to make it a reality. Finally, we have the outright impostor, the most audacious figure of all. This is someone who knowingly fabricates their connection to royalty, constructing an elaborate deception to seize power, fame, or wealth they have no true right to. The lines between these categories can sometimes blur, especially when historical records are incomplete or disputed, which is what makes their stories so perpetually intriguing. So why do these figures, especially the more dubious ones, capture our imagination so completely? They tap into our deepest fascinations with identity, destiny, and the questioning of established order. A pretender offers a compelling narrative, a potential Cinderella story, or a thrilling conspiracy. They represent the ultimate what if, a living challenge to the status quo that makes us wonder if the world could be radically different. Their emergence creates a crack in the foundation of power, and through that crack pours every manner of scandal, rumor, and diplomatic intrigue. For the established monarchy, a credible pretender is a direct threat, not just to one ruler, but to the entire system's stability. Their very existence can become a rallying point for discontented nobles, foreign powers seeking influence, or a public disillusioned with their current sovereign. This is why these claims so often erupt into international scandals. A throne is never just a chair. It's a symbol of national identity and a key piece on the global chessboard. When a new claimant appears, other nations are forced to take a side. Recognizing a pretender can be a deliberate act of aggression against the ruling monarchy, a way to destabilize a rival country without firing a single shot. Allies must be consulted, spies are deployed to verify pedigrees, and fortunes are spent on propaganda to either bolster or discredit the claim. The stakes are unimaginably high, involving the fate of nations, the balance of power in Europe, and the colossal sums of money required to bankroll such a grandiose ambition. It is within this volatile mixture of politics, money, and ancestral dreams that our story truly begins. The story of modern royal claimants truly begins not with a grand battle, but with a whispered escape from London on a cold December night in 1688. King James II of England, a Catholic monarch in an increasingly Protestant nation, was fleeing an invading army led by his own son-in-law, William of Orange. In his haste, the king dropped the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames, a powerful symbolic act that seemed to seal his fate. But he took with him something far more precious: his infant son and heir, James Francis Edward Stuart. This child, smuggled to safety in France, would become the original king over the water, the figurehead for a cause that would consume his life and ignite a political fire that burned for generations. He is known to history as the Old Pretender, a title that itself was a piece of political propaganda used by his enemies to cast doubt on the legitimacy of his claim. James's entire existence was a controversy from the moment he was born. His Catholic father's new male heir displaced his Protestant half-sisters, Mary and Anne, in the line of succession, directly triggering the glorious revolution that overthrew the Stuart dynasty. His opponents in England circulated the vicious warming pan myth, a fabricated story claiming the baby was not the Queen's true son, but had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan to provide a Catholic heir. This baseless rumor, though completely false, was a powerful tool used for decades to undermine his legitimacy. Growing up in the court of his cousin, King Louis XIV of France, James was raised with one singular purpose: to reclaim the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland that he believed were his divine right. He was never allowed to forget his identity as a king in exile. Educated in statecraft, military strategy, and the unwavering belief in his own destiny, his cause became known as Jacobitism, from the Latin Jacobus, for James. It was far more than a simple political movement. It was a potent mix of dynastic loyalty, religious fervor, and nationalist sentiment, particularly in Catholic Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. The Jacobites didn't just support a man, they championed a principle: the divine right of kings and the legitimacy of the Stuart bloodline against what they saw as the usurpation by the German Hanoverians. James became the symbol around which all discontent with the new Protestant monarchy could coalesce. He made his first serious attempt to seize his crown in 1715, a rebellion known as the 15 for the year it began. Landing in Scotland after the Jacobite clans had already risen, his presence was met with hope. But the campaign was plagued by hesitation and poor coordination. The climactic Battle of Sheriffmuir was indecisive, and with promised support from France failing to materialize, James, profoundly disappointed by the lack of enthusiastic support he encountered, returned to exile on the continent without ever having set foot in England. This failure set a pattern that would define his life and the Jacobite cause. James was often described as reserved, pious, and lacking the magnetic charisma necessary to inspire a risky revolution. He was a man of principle rather than a man of action, which left him constantly waiting for the perfect moment that never came, reliant on the shifting political whims of European powers like France and Spain, who supported him only when it suited their own agendas against Britain. After the failure of the 15, his hopes increasingly turned to his sons, particularly the dashing and charismatic Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. James lived long enough to see his son launch the monumental but ultimately catastrophic rebellion of 1745, which ended in the brutal slaughter at the Battle of Culloden. He died in Rome in 1766, a king without a kingdom who had spent his entire life pursuing a throne he only ever saw from afar. Yet, in his persistent, lifelong claim, James Francis Edward Stuart established the blueprint for every royal claimant who followed, proving that a title could be a powerful weapon, even if it was only ever asserted from exile. If James the Old Pretender was the steadfast, patient architect of the Jacobite cause, then his son, Charles Edward Stuart, was its dazzling, flawed, and ultimately tragic firework. Known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender, he burst onto the scene with all the charisma and romantic bravado his father lacked, transforming a political struggle into a legendary tale of passion and adventure that continues to capture hearts centuries later. His story is the ultimate what if, a dramatic arc that took him from the brink of victory to a crushing, definitive defeat, forever sealing the fate of the Stuart dream while paradoxically ensuring its immortality in song and story. The stage was set for his grand entrance in the summer of 1745. Britain was deeply entangled in the War of Austrian Succession, with King George II's prime minister and most of his seasoned troops were fighting on the continent. For the exiled Stuarts in Rome, this seemed like a moment of perfect opportunity. With a promise of limited support from France, the 24-year-old prince, brimming with confidence, set sail for Scotland with just 2 ships and a handful of companions. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. One of the ships, carrying his weapons and soldiers, was forced to turn back after a skirmish with a British warship. Undeterred, Charles landed on the tiny Isle of Heiress with only the 7 men who became known as the 7 Men of Moidart. He had arrived, quite literally, with little more than his name, his charm, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. The young prince, with his tall stature, graceful manner, and striking presence, was a figure straight out of a Highland fantasy. He spoke of reclaiming his father's crown not just for himself, but for the glory of Scotland. This powerful appeal to Scottish nationalism, combined with his magnetic personality, began to win over the powerful clan chiefs who were initially deeply skeptical of a campaign with so little foreign backing. The Jacobite standard was raised at Glenfinnan, and clansmen began to rally to the cause. His army, a mix of Catholic Highlanders and Episcopalian Lowlanders, was initially small, but it was fiercely devoted. Against all odds, this ragtag force began a stunningly successful campaign. They captured Edinburgh, and at the Battle of Prestonpans, they routed a government force in a matter of minutes, a victory that sent shockwaves through London and made the prince and his Highland army seem invincible. Flush with this unexpected success, Charles made his most fateful decision. Against the strong advice of his most seasoned Scottish commander, Lord George Murray, who argued for consolidating their power in Scotland, the prince insisted on marching south into England. He was convinced that the English Jacobites and a disillusioned public would rise up to join him en masse. His army, now swelling with confidence, pressed on, reaching as far south as Derby, a mere 125 miles from London. Panic seized the capital. King George II was said to have packed his bags, ready to flee, but the promised English uprising never materialized. The people watched from the sidelines, curious but cautious. The French invasion force that Charles had banked on remained conspicuously absent. Isolated, deep in enemy territory, and with government forces closing in, his council of war made the devastating decision to retreat back to Scotland. It was the turning point, the moment the dream began to curdle. The long, dispiriting retreat north in the harsh winter weather cost the Jacobite army its morale and many of its men. The final brutal end came on a cold, damp morning in April 1746 on Culloden Moor. This was not the kind of terrain that favored the Highlanders' fierce, rapid charge. The ground was boggy, hindering their advance, and they faced a disciplined, well-artillered government army under the Duke of Cumberland. In less than an hour, the Jacobite cause was systematically and ruthlessly slaughtered. Charles, reportedly against his will, was led from the field as his supporters were cut down. The aftermath was a calculated campaign of terror, earning Cumberland the nickname Butcher as his troops hunted down and executed Jacobite sympathizers across the Highlands in a brutal effort to extinguish the rebellion forever. What followed the battle is perhaps the most legendary part of his story: the prince's dramatic 5-month escape through the Hebrides. a fugitive with a price of £30,000 on his head. This is where the romantic legend was truly forged. With the British Navy scouring the seas and redcoat patrols scouring the glens, he relied entirely on the loyalty and courage of Scottish supporters, most famously Flora MacDonald, who helped him disguise himself as her Irish maid, Betty Burke, to sail past government checkpoints. These ordinary men and women risked everything to protect him, a testament to the powerful personal loyalty he could inspire. He finally escaped aboard a French ship, leaving the very people who had sacrificed everything for him to face the terrible consequences of Cumberland's wrath. His life after Culloden was a long, sad anticlimax. He returned to a life of exile, but the charming, determined prince was gone, replaced by a bitter, increasingly alcoholic man, embittered by his failure and abandoned by his former allies. His romantic legacy, however, only grew stronger in his absence. In defeat, he became a symbol of lost glory and romantic resistance. The hundreds of songs, poems, and stories that emerged, from the wistful skyboat song to the haunting "Will Ye No Come Back Again?" transformed a failed military campaign into an enduring cultural legend. This romantic myth-making is precisely why his story continues to inspire claimants to this day. He proved that a claim could be powered not just by legal right, but by the potent force of a compelling narrative, a charismatic personality, and the undying hope for a restored golden age. He became the blueprint for the romantic, tragic hero, and that is a legacy far more powerful than any crown he ever sought. While the Stuart dramas unfolded in the foggy highlands of Scotland and the courts of Europe, a very different kind of royal claim was taking shape across the Atlantic, one born not from exile and rebellion, but from a reluctant abdication and a complex New World legacy. Our scene shifts to late 19th century Brazil, a vast nation that had peacefully gained its independence from Portugal and was ruled by a beloved figure, Emperor Pedro II. His nearly 50-year reign was a period of remarkable stability and progress, but it came to a sudden end in 1889 when a military coup, lacking any significant public support, forced his abdication. The emperor, a weary and disillusioned man, went into exile in Europe with his family. In a poignant twist of fate, the Brazilian people, who had largely been bystanders to the coup, were said to be genuinely sorrowful to see their monarch depart. This peaceful departure, however, did not mean the imperial idea died. It merely went dormant, waiting for future generations to revive it and to argue passionately over who should lead it. The heart of this modern dispute lies with Pedro II's descendants and the intricate web of royal marriage alliances that followed. The emperor had 2 daughters. His eldest, Isabel, Princess Imperial of Brazil, is a monumental figure in the nation's history. She served as regent on 3 separate occasions, and in one of her most famous acts, signed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, in 1888. WHICH, Chinese letter, 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 a BOLISHED, slavery in Brazil entirely. For this, she earned the enduring nickname, the Redemptress. Her marriage to a French prince, Gaston of Orléans, Count of EU, united the Brazilian imperial family with the Orléans branch of the former French royal family. This union created the House of Orléans-Braganza, the family from which all subsequent claimants to the Brazilian throne descend. The controversy that would eventually split the family began with their three sons, Pedro de Alcantara, Luis, and Antonio. The initial succession seemed straightforward. The eldest son, Pedro de Alcantara, was the obvious heir. However, in 1908, he did something that shocked the monarchist community. He renounced his rights of succession for himself and his descendants. His reasons were personal. He wished to marry a Bohemian countess, Elizabeth Dobozinski de Dobozinix, who, despite her noble birth, was not considered of equal rank according to the strict dynastic house laws that the family claimed to follow. To marry for love, he stepped aside. The title of Pedro III, claimant to the Brazilian throne, then passed to his next younger brother, Luis. This is where the modern dispute truly ignites. One branch of the family argues that Pedro de Alcantara's renunciation was entirely valid and binding, making the descendants of his brother Luis the legitimate heirs. This branch is known as the Heiresses line, named after the city in Brazil where they have historically been based. The opposing viewpoint, held by the descendants of Pedro de Alcantara himself, argues that the renunciation was actually invalid. Their reasoning is a fascinating legalistic puzzle. They contend that the dynastic rules which required equal marriages were not actually Brazilian at all, but old Portuguese laws that the Brazilian Empire had never formally adopted. Therefore, Pedro de Alcantara's marriage was perfectly valid. His renunciation was unnecessary and thus null and void, and the claim should rightly have passed through his line. This branch is known as the Patropolis line. So, for decades, these two branches of the same family have put forward two different men, both great-grandsons of Princess Isabel, each claiming to be the true imperial heir. The Heiresses line, descending from Luis, was long represented by Prince Luis Gastão, who lived a long and dedicated life as the claimant until his death in 2022. The Patropolis line, descending from the eldest son who renounced, is represented by Prince Pedro Carlos. This is far more than a simple family squabble. It is a debate that cuts to the very core of what constitutes legitimacy for a throne that no longer even exists. It involves intense scrutiny of historical documents, imperial constitutions, and marital contracts. Active monarchist groups in Brazil are forced to choose sides, dividing a movement that is already a minority in a modern republic. The debate is carried out in books, on specialized websites, and at historical gatherings, with each side presenting its case with great seriousness. The passions involved demonstrate the powerful, almost mystical hold that lineage and legacy can have, even generations after the crown has vanished. It is a quiet, persistent echo of the past, a legal and historical argument over a symbol of power, proving that the question of who has the right to rule can outlive the rule itself by more than a century. Yet another continent away, a royal dispute of even greater complexity and far deeper historical bitterness was simmering in France, a nation that had not one, but two competing royal families, each with a persuasive argument for why their bloodline alone held the legitimate right to the throne. Imagine a nation with two sets of kings in waiting, two sets of courtiers, and two sets of devoted followers, all locked in a polite but fiercely uncompromising ideological war that has lasted for nearly 200 years. This is the enduring schism between the Legitimists and the Orléanists, a debate that is less about personal animosity and more about a fundamental, irreconcilable disagreement over the very principles of monarchy itself. To understand this divide, we must rewind to the turbulent 19th century. The French Revolution had executed King Louis XVI, but the idea of a monarchy never truly died. It was restored in 1814 with his younger brother, who took the throne as Louis XVIII. He was succeeded by his other brother, Charles X. These brothers were direct descendants of Louis XIV, the Sun King, representing the senior, most ancient Bourbon line. Their rule was characterized by a desire to return to the ancient regime, the old order before the revolution. However, Charles X's ultra-conservative policies provoked another revolution in 1830, the July Revolution, which forced him to abdicate. This is the moment the split became permanent. The Legitimist branch upholds the claim of Charles X and his descendants. They argue that his abdication was forced and therefore illegitimate, and that the sacred, divine right of kings passed through his line alone. For Legitimists, principle is everything. The line of succession is an unbreakable chain mandated by God and ancient Salic law, not something to be altered by parliaments or popular revolt. But in 1830, the French Parliament did not declare a republic. Instead, it looked for a more palatable constitutional monarch and found one in a cousin, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans. He was descended from a younger brother of Louis XIV, making his branch of the family, the House of Orléans, a junior line of the Bourbons. His supporters, who became known as Orléanists, saw him as a modern solution, a citizen king who would rule under a constitutional charter and embrace the more liberal ideals that had emerged from the revolution. His reign lasted until 1848, when yet another revolution sent him into exile. For Orléanists, legitimacy is not just about blood. It is about legality and pragmatism. They argue that Louis Philippe was officially chosen by the representatives of the French people, making his reign and the claims of his descendants legally valid. They represent a vision of a modern parliamentary monarchy that could potentially reconcile with a democratic France. The personal animosity between these two royal houses runs deep and historical. The bitterness goes all the way back to the Revolution, when Louis Philippe's father, Philippe Égalité, notoriously voted for the execution of his own cousin, Louis XVI. To the senior Legitimist branch, the Orléans family were not just rivals. They were regicides and traitors to the crown who had eagerly profited from the misery of their own kinsmen. This original sin has colored the relationship for centuries. For generations, the two families lived in separate circles of exile, refusing to acknowledge each other's claims. The Legitimist line eventually passed to the Spanish Bourbons through a descendant of Charles X, while the Orléanist line continued through Louis Philippe's descendants. In recent decades, there have been attempts to bridge this ancient divide. The current Orléanist claimant, Jean, Count of Paris, made a significant gesture by recognizing the head of the Spanish Bourbon line, Louis Alphonse, Duke of Anjou, as the senior representative of the House of Bourbon. However, he carefully did not recognize him as the heir to the French throne, maintaining that his own claim through the Orléans line remains the only one that is both legally and practically viable for modern France. The response from the Legitimist side remains one of polite but firm principle. They view this as a nice personal gesture, but ultimately irrelevant to the matter of dynastic law. For them, the sacred right of succession is immutable. This is what makes the French dispute so intellectually fascinating and so stubbornly persistent. It is a clash between two entirely different worldviews, one of divine right and absolute principle versus one of legal contract and pragmatic compromise. It is a debate that has survived revolutions, republics, and world wars, proving that the quest for a crown is often a battle not just for a title, but for the very soul of a nation's history. Of all the royal mysteries born from the ashes of revolution, none has captured the global imagination quite like the tragic story of the Romanovs and the haunting question of a possible survivor. The brutal execution of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children in a basement in Yekaterinburg in 1918 was meant to be a final, definitive end to the Russian imperial line. The Bolsheviks intended for the world to believe that not a single trace of the family remained. Yet, from this act of calculated annihilation, a powerful legend was born, fueled by the desperate human need for a miracle and the tantalizing possibility that the youngest daughter, the vivacious Grand Duchess Anastasia, might have somehow cheated death. This wasn't just a hope. It became an industry, attracting a bewildering parade of women who stepped out of the shadows, each claiming to be the lost princess. For years, the Soviet authorities maintained a veil of secrecy around the exact details of the execution and the disposal of the bodies. This official silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed rumor, speculation, and fantasy. The idea that one of the beautiful young Grand Duchesses could have survived the hail of bullets, perhaps protected by the jewels sewn into their corsets, was a narrative too compelling to fade away. The first claimants began to appear in the early 1920s, emerging from the chaos of post-war Europe. These were often traumatized, displaced women, many suffering from amnesia or mental illness, who were identified by others as resembling the missing princess. Dozens came forward, but one woman's story would eclipse all others, transforming a personal claim into a worldwide cultural phenomenon that would persist for most of the 20th century. Her name was Anna Anderson, and her emergence from a Berlin canal in 1920 was the beginning of one of history's most elaborate and enduring impersonations. Rescued from a suicide attempt, she was placed in a mental asylum where she initially refused to give any name. It was another patient who first suggested the incredible notion that this silent, disturbed young woman might be the Grand Duchess Anastasia. Slowly, hesitantly, Anderson began to embrace this new identity. Her knowledge of the Russian imperial court and the Romanov family was patchy and often wrong, explained away by supporters as a result of her traumatic ordeal. She spoke German, not Russian, and her mannerisms seemed entirely unroyal. Yet, she possessed an undeniable, piercing gaze and a stubborn, imperious demeanor that convinced many who desperately wanted to believe. Her case became a transatlantic cause célèbre. She attracted a devoted group of supporters, including former aristocrats and members of the extended Romanov family, some of whom, after meeting her, became convinced of her authenticity. They pointed to her physical similarities to Anastasia: her blue eyes, her facial structure, a distinctive deformity on one foot. They clung to her occasional, uncanny recollection of an obscure detail from life at the palace. Yet for every supporter, there was a powerful detractor. Most of the surviving Romanovs, including the Dowager Empress Marie Fedorovna, Anastasia's own grandmother, met her and unequivocally declared her an impostor. Pierre Gilliard, the Swiss tutor who had spent years with the royal children, published a book denouncing her. The debate spilled out of drawing rooms and into courtrooms, with legal battles over her identity raging for decades. Anderson herself became a prisoner of the narrative she had created, living a life defined by this single, colossal claim. The controversy surrounding Anna Anderson was finally, definitively settled not by aristocratic intuition or court rulings, but by the irrefutable power of science. In the early 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mass grave containing the remains of the Romanov family was finally discovered and exhumed. Mitochondrial DNA testing, a technology that would have seemed like science fiction in Anderson's heyday, provided the answer. The bones were conclusively identified as those of the Tsar, his wife, and 3 of their daughters. 2 bodies were initially missing from the grave, those of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the 4 sisters, which only fueled the Anastasia myth for a few more years. However, when those final 2 sets of remains were discovered in 2007, DNA analysis confirmed the entire family had perished in that basement. To settle the Anderson question once and for all, a sample of her tissue, preserved from a surgery years earlier, was tested against the Romanov DNA. The results were conclusive. Anna Anderson could not possibly have been related to the Tsarina Alexandra. Further investigation revealed her true identity. She was Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had suffered a mental breakdown and vanished from her home around the same time Anderson appeared. The DNA evidence was a clean, clinical end to a messy, emotional human drama that had lasted for over 70 years. The myth of Anastasia's survival was debunked, yet its cultural power remains undiminished. It speaks to our profound fascination with lost royalty, the allure of a Cinderella story in reverse, and our desire to believe in miracles, even in the face of overwhelming horror. Anna Anderson's story is a testament to the fact that a compelling narrative, passionately believed and fiercely defended, can sometimes become more powerful than the truth itself, creating a royal mystery so captivating that the world chose to believe it long after the facts had whispered otherwise. This obsession with hidden heirs and imprisoned rivals finds perhaps its most enduring and enigmatic expression in the legend of the man in the iron mask. For over 3 centuries, this mysterious figure has captivated historians and storytellers alike. A real-life ghost from the reign of Louis XIV, whose true identity became one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. His story begins not with a public claim to a throne, but with his silent, anonymous existence as a state prisoner of the highest secrecy. The facts we do know are sparse, but chilling. For decades, a prisoner of unknown origin was moved between various fortresses, most famously the Bastille in Paris, under the direct orders of the king's most powerful minister. His identity was concealed by a mask, which historical documents suggest was actually made of black velvet, not iron, a detail that makes the story no less dramatic. He was treated with a strange mixture of severity and deference. He was kept in strict isolation, forbidden from speaking to his guards, yet provided with fine clothes and food befitting a person of extreme importance. The one constant was the absolute secrecy surrounding his name and his crime, a secret so potent that it was said the few people who knew it took it to their graves. Naturally, such an elaborate mystery has spawned a multitude of theories, each attempting to solve the riddle of who warranted such extraordinary measures. The most persistent and politically explosive theory, popularized by the philosopher Voltaire and later immortalized by Alexander Dumas in his novel, posits that the masked prisoner was the illegitimate older twin brother of Louis XIV himself. According to this compelling narrative, the queen had given birth to twins, but to avoid a future succession crisis and civil war, the second-born son was immediately secreted away. He would be raised in ignorance of his true identity, only to be discovered years later. Upon learning of this living, breathing challenge to his absolute authority, the Sun King could not execute his own brother, but he could not allow him to exist freely. The Iron Mask, then, was not merely to conceal his features, which were supposedly identical to the king's, but to forever silence a walking, talking threat to the legitimacy of the entire French monarchy. This theory resonates so powerfully because it taps directly into the deepest fears of any absolute ruler. A rival with an equal, or even superior, claim to the throne. Other theories, while less cinematic, are equally fascinating. Some historians have argued he was a high-ranking nobleman who had committed a grave offense against the crown, such as the Duc de Beaufort, a popular figure who led a rebellion against the king's regency. However, records show the Duke died in battle, making this unlikely. Another candidate is Eustache Dodger, a valet whose name appears in the original prison registries. Proponents of this theory suggest Dodger may have been a low-level servant who accidentally overheard or witnessed a devastating state secret, perhaps related to the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal that implicated members of the court in black magic and plots to kill the king. His low birth would explain why he could be imprisoned for life without a trial, while the secret he held would explain the unprecedented level of secrecy imposed upon him. Yet another compelling candidate is Count Ercole Mattioli, an Italian minister and double agent. Louis XIV had enlisted Mattioli to secretly negotiate the purchase of the strategically crucial fortress of Casale in Italy. Instead of completing the deal, Mattioli betrayed the king's confidence and attempted to sell the information to other European powers. In retaliation, Louis had him kidnapped and imprisoned in France for the rest of his life. This theory fits the known facts remarkably well. The timing of Mattioli's disappearance aligns with the prisoner's arrival and the nature of his crime, a profound personal betrayal that humiliated the Sun King would perfectly justify a punishment of lifelong anonymous incarceration. It was a stark warning to anyone who would dare to cross the most powerful monarch in Europe. The true identity of the man in the Iron Mask will almost certainly never be known for certain, as the crucial documents were likely destroyed by order of the king himself. But the enduring power of the legend, particularly the theory of the king's hidden brother, lies in what it represents. He is the ultimate symbol of the absolute power Louis XIV wielded, a power so complete it could make a man vanish from history, his very name erased, his face concealed, all to protect the unchallenged authority of the throne. He is the dark flip side to the glorious image of the Sun King, a permanent reminder that behind the splendor of Versailles lay a ruthless machinery of state that would stop at nothing to eliminate any threat, real or imagined. Moving from the historical drama of the man in the iron mask, we arrive at a living, breathing claimant whose very existence is a direct continuation of that ancient royal legacy. In modern-day France, a nation firmly rooted in its republican ideals, Prince Louis Alphonse, Duke of Anjou, carries himself with the quiet dignity of a king in waiting. As the current head of the House of Bourbon and the legitimist claimant to a throne that has been vacant for over a century, he embodies a paradox, a man dedicated to a title that holds no legal power, yet one that commands profound respect and loyalty from a dedicated circle of aristocrats and historians. His claim is not based on a desire for political power, but on what he and his supporters see as a sacred, unbroken duty to his lineage and to the history of France itself. His descent is meticulously documented and forms the bedrock of his entire claim. Louis Alphonse is a direct descendant in the male line of Louis XIV, the Sun King, through his great-grandson, King Philip V of Spain. This connection is crucial to the Legitimist argument. When the last direct French Bourbon, Charles X, was forced to abdicate in 1830, the Legitimist cause eventually passed to his grandson, Henry, Count of Chambord. Upon his death in 1883, without an heir, the claim was argued to have passed to the senior most male heir of the Bourbon dynasty, who was at that time a descendant of Philip V of Spain. This is the line from which Louis Alphonse descends. Legitimists uphold the fundamental principle of Salic law, which prohibits succession through the female line and emphasizes direct male descent. They argue that this unbroken chain of male heirs, stretching back centuries, makes Louis Alphonse the undisputed heir, the Duke of Anjou, and the rightful, though uncrowned, Louis XX of France. To maintain this pretension in a modern republic requires a fascinating and deliberate performance of royalty. Louis Alphonse and his family engage in a constant, subtle pageantry designed to keep the flame of monarchy alive. They make regular public appearances at ceremonies steeped in symbolism, such as the annual Mass in Paris, commemorating the execution of King Louis XVI, an event that draws monarchists from across the country. He officiates at chivalric ceremonies for the Order of the Holy Spirit, a knightly order originally founded by Henry III of France, bestowing honors in a tradition that has been carefully preserved. He and his wife, the Venezuelan-born Princess Marie Marguerite, undertake what their supporters call royal tours, visiting historical sites and meeting with members of the nobility, treating these events with the solemnity of state visits. Every gesture, from the fleur-de-lis on his coat of arms to the precise use of his titles, is a conscious act of continuity. His supporters, while a small minority in France, are passionate and well-organized. They are not rallying for an imminent restoration of the monarchy. Rather, They see themselves as custodians of a cultural and historical heritage they believe is integral to the French identity. They publish journals, organize lectures, and maintain a vibrant online presence, debating points of dynastic law with a seriousness that mirrors the academic intensity of the Brazilian imperial dispute. For them, Louis Alphonse is a living symbol of a France that once was a nation of order, tradition, and Catholic faith. His role is to be present, to embody the principle of legitimacy, and to ensure that this particular thread of history is not forgotten, even if it exists largely in the realm of symbolism and historical memory. In a world of rapid change, he represents a permanent, unchanging link to a past that continues to hold a powerful, romantic allure for those who choose to remember it. Yet even as these claimants uphold their legacies from the sidelines of modern politics, one man carries the weight of a truly imperial inheritance, not merely as a royal heir, but as the living symbol of a vanished empire that once shaped the destiny of Europe itself. Karl von Habsburg, the current head of the historic House of Habsburg, is far more than a claimant to a long-abolished throne. He is a diplomat, a politician, and a global advocate who has masterfully reframed his family's ancient legacy for the 21st century. As the grandson of the last Austro-Hungarian emperor, Karl I, his very presence is a bridge to a world of emperors and archdukes. Yet he has chosen a path of active, modern engagement rather than quiet ceremonial observance. His claim, while possessing no legal standing in the Austrian Republic, is rooted in a dynasty that once ruled over a vast and diverse collection of kingdoms and principalities for centuries. The Habsburgs were the architects of European power politics, their influence stretching from the shores of the Americas to the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire. Their rule ended abruptly in 1918, following the catastrophe of the First World War, with the empire dismantled and the family formally exiled from Austria. For decades, Habsburg heirs were forbidden from even returning to their homeland unless they renounced all claims to the throne and swore loyalty to the Republic. It was not until the 1960s that his father, Otto von Habsburg, a prominent European politician and intellectual, was finally able to return after making that reluctant pledge. This act, while seemingly a renunciation, did not extinguish the dynastic claim in the eyes of their supporters. It simply acknowledged political reality, allowing the family to re-engage with Austria on new terms. Karl von Habsburg has built upon this foundation with remarkable skill, carving out a unique space for himself that blends his heritage with a thoroughly contemporary mission. Unlike many of his counterparts who focus solely on historical remembrance, he pursued a dynamic career in Austrian politics and on the international stage. He served as a member of the European Parliament for the Austrian People's Party, where he was a vocal advocate for European integration, a cause deeply aligned with his father's vision of a united and peaceful continent, free from the nationalist rivalries that destroyed his own empire. His work has consistently focused on cultural protection, security policy, and media freedom, demonstrating a practical application of his imperial values: unity, stability, and the protection of diverse cultures within a modern democratic framework. Perhaps his most impactful role has been as the president of the Blue Shield International, an organization dedicated to protecting cultural heritage threatened by armed conflict and natural disasters. In this position, he is not Prince Karl of Austria. He is Karl von Habsburg, a respected international advocate. He has traveled to conflict zones, working to prevent the destruction of ancient monuments and museums, a mission that directly echoes the Habsburgs' historical role as patrons of art and custodians of Europe's cultural tapestry. This work provides a powerful and noble outlet for the concept of imperial duty, transforming it from a claim of governance into a global humanitarian effort. He doesn't just talk about his family's history. He actively works to preserve the shared history of humanity. His efforts to maintain the family's legacy are both visible and subtle. He and his family make regular public appearances at events like the annual funeral mass for his great-great-grandfather, Emperor Franz Joseph, an event that still draws crowds and media attention in Vienna. He carefully manages the family's considerable archival and artistic patrimony, understanding its importance to European history. Yet, he does so without the pretense of expecting a restored throne. Instead, he promotes the Habsburg legacy as one of service and cultural bridging, a relevant philosophy for a modern, interconnected Europe. For Karl von Habsburg, the crown is not a political goal but a platform, a source of soft power and historical responsibility that he uses to advocate for a world where the mistakes of the past are not repeated and where cultural heritage is recognized as a universal human right. While the mystery of Anastasia has been solved by science, the idea of a restored Russian monarchy has never completely vanished. In the decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a fascinating and complex movement emerged from the shadows, one that looks not to the past for a lost princess, but to the future for a potential Tsar. This is the Romanov Restoration movement, a patchwork of historians, monarchists, and aristocrats who believe that the answer to modern Russia's spiritual and political woes lies in a return to its imperial roots, under the guidance of a rightful heir from the House of Romanov. But identifying who that rightful heir should be has proven to be a question as divisive as any in Russian history, sparking a quiet but intense debate over laws, legitimacy, and faith. The landscape of potential Romanov claimants is more a sprawling family tree than a clear line of succession. The massacre in Yekaterinburg extinguished the main branch of the family, but numerous cousins, nephews, and other relatives survived and fled into exile. Their descendants are now scattered across Europe and America, and many have maintained a strong connection to their heritage. The most widely recognized head of the Romanov Family Association for many years was Prince Nicholas Romanov, a descendant of Tsar Nicholas I. He represented a more pragmatic, collective view of the family, often stating that while they cherished their history, they did not actively seek restoration and believed the future of Russia should be decided by its people. This view, however, is not universally held within the family or among its supporters. The debate over succession is fraught with historical and legal complexity. The fundamental issue revolves around the ancient Pauline laws, established by Emperor Paul I in 1797. These laws provided a very strict set of rules for the imperial succession, including the critical requirement for equal marriages. This meant that to pass on dynastic rights, a Grand Duke or Prince had to marry a woman of equal royal or sovereign status. If a Romanov married a commoner or even a noblewoman not from a reigning house, the marriage was considered morganatic, and any children from that union would be excluded from the line of succession. In the 20th century, as the family lived in exile, many Romanovs married for love rather than dynastic duty, leading to a situation where a significant portion of the modern family is considered ineligible for the throne by traditionalists who strictly adhere to these ancient laws. This is where the story takes a dramatic and controversial turn with the emergence of Prince Karl Emmich of Leiningen. He is not a Romanov by name, but rather a descendant of the Russian imperial line through his mother, Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna. She is the only child of Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, a claimant who argued that his branch of the family was the last that adhered strictly to the Pauline laws. Upon her father's death, Maria Vladimirovna declared herself the head of the Imperial House of Russia, a title she uses to this day. Her supporters, known as the Vladimirovichy group, believe she is the sole legitimate heir because her parents' marriage was between two members of officially recognized royal houses. Her son, Karl Emmich, was thus raised as her heir apparent. In 2013, Karl Emmich, then a German prince, made a series of stunning announcements. First, he converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, taking the name Nikolai Kirillovich. This was a profoundly symbolic act, as Orthodoxy is intrinsically linked to the Russian monarchy. The Tsar was seen as the defender of the faith. Then, his mother formally recognized him as her successor in Cesarevich, the heir to the hypothetical throne. To further solidify his claim, he married a member of the German nobility under Orthodox rites. His supporters present him as a modern candidate who respects ancient tradition, a businessman with the skills to potentially steward a constitutional monarchy. However, his claim is hotly disputed. Critics from other Romanov branches and rival monarchist groups point out that his descent is through the female line. His mother, which they argue is invalid under the very Pauline laws his family claims to uphold. They also question the legitimacy of his mother's claim in the first place, arguing that her branch has no superior right over other descendants. Furthermore, his conversion, while significant, is viewed by some as a calculated political move rather than a sincere spiritual journey. The Russian Orthodox Church itself has remained studiously neutral on the question of restoration, focusing on its spiritual mission rather than endorsing any specific claimant. The restoration movement itself is a minority within Russian society, but it is a vocal and passionate one. Its arguments are less about a return to absolute autocracy and more about offering a symbol of national unity, historical continuity, and moral authority beyond the fray of partisan politics. They speak of the monarchy as a unifying force, a living embodiment of Russia's 1,000-year history that could help heal the traumatic fissures of the 20th century. Whether this remains a nostalgic dream or ever becomes a political reality rests on a fragile combination of historical precedent, the interpretation of century-old laws, and the unpredictable will of the Russian people. The quest for a new Tsar continues, a quiet but persistent echo of an empire's long-lost glory. While the legacies of long-deposed empires like Russia or Austria feel like distant history, the story of the Greek royal family offers a uniquely modern and personal take on the life of a claimant. Theirs is not a tale centuries old, but a very contemporary drama of a monarchy voted out of existence within living memory, leaving a family that continues to navigate its place in a nation that both romanticizes and rejects them. Unlike the Habsburgs or Romanovs, the Greek royals weren't overthrown by revolution or war. They were dismissed by a referendum, a democratic act that makes their continued presence all the more complex and fascinating. The family's origins on the throne are themselves a relatively recent European invention. In 1832, after gaining independence from the Ottoman Empire, the great powers of Britain, France, and Russia searched for a king to bring stability to the new Greek nation. Their choice fell on a 17-year-old Bavarian prince, Otto. His reign was troubled, and he was eventually deposed. The next search for a monarch led to Prince William of Denmark, who took the throne in 1863 as King George I of the Hellenes. It was from this Danish line that the modern family descends, a fact underscored by their surname, Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg-Glücksburg. For much of the next century, the Greek monarchy's history was a roller coaster of coups, exiles, and restorations, a constant struggle to remain relevant amidst intense political volatility. The central figure in the modern chapter is the late King Constantine II. His life story reads like a Shakespearean tragedy intertwined with a modern soap opera. He ascended the throne in 1964 at the young age of 23, already a national hero for having won an Olympic gold medal in sailing. Handsome, charismatic, and initially immensely popular, he seemed poised for a successful reign. However, his rule immediately collided with the immense political turbulence of the era. A power struggle with the elected government, followed by a military coup in 1967, placed the young king in an impossible position. After a failed counter-coup against the ruling junta, he was forced into exile with his young family. For the next 7 years, a brutal military dictatorship ruled Greece in his name while he lived abroad, powerless. The final blow came in 1973. The junta, seeking to consolidate its power, staged a referendum on the monarchy. Under conditions that were far from free or fair, the Greek people were asked to vote on abolishing the crown. The official result was an overwhelming vote for a republic. Even after the fall of the junta in 1974, a new referendum confirmed the abolition, this time conducted democratically. For Constantine, this was a profound personal and political defeat. The nation he was born to rule had formally and legally ended the institution of monarchy. He spent decades in a kind of diplomatic limbo, living primarily in London. His relationship with his homeland was strained. For a time, the government even refused him a Greek passport, recognizing him only as a Danish citizen. He was a king without a kingdom, and for many Greeks, a symbol of a divisive and painful past they wished to move beyond. Yet, the family never faded into complete obscurity. Constantine's marriage to the beautiful Princess Anne-Marie of Denmark was a strong and lasting union, and together they raised 5 children who grew up in the full glare of the international media. Unlike claimants from older dynasties, the Greek royals were modern, photogenic, and accessible. They were frequently photographed at royal weddings and events across Europe, maintaining close ties with the British, Spanish, and Danish royal families. This visibility kept their royal status alive in the public imagination, even if it was a status not recognized by their own country. They were, in effect, royalty by association and by blood, if not by law. The passing of the mantle to the next generation has introduced a new dynamic. Constantine's eldest son and heir, Pavlos, the crown prince of Greece, leads a decidedly modern life. He works in finance, married a hugely successful heiress and entrepreneur, Marie Chantal Miller, and they are raising their 5 children between New York and London. He is a businessman and a socialite, a far cry from the image of a secluded king in waiting. He and his siblings occasionally speak of their love for Greece and their hope for reconciliation, but they do so without the overt political ambition of their father. Their claim feels different, less about a desire to rule and more about an enduring familial and cultural connection to a country that remains a part of their identity. This creates a fascinating paradox. The Greek royal family maintains all the trappings of royalty, titles recognized by international royalty guides, a place in the line of succession to the Danish throne, and an active role in the European aristocratic social circuit. Yet, in their own country, they are private citizens. Their continued presence in the spotlight, coupled with their total lack of political power, makes them perhaps the purest example of modern royalty, a brand, a family business built on heritage and celebrity rather than governance. Their story is a poignant reminder that in the modern world, a crown can be just as powerful as a memory and a title as it is as a physical object, sustaining a legacy long after the throne itself has turned to dust. Within this intricate web of Romanov claimants, one figure stands apart, commanding both ardent loyalty and fierce opposition. Princess Maria Vladimirovna presents herself not merely as a descendant, but as the one true head of the Imperial House of Russia, a title she inherited from her father, Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich. Her claim is built upon a foundation of strict legalism, centering on a pivotal and controversial interpretation of those ancient dynastic laws. She argues that her parents' union was the last fully dynastic marriage within the family, conforming to the rigid standards set by Emperor Paul I. Her father, Grand Duke Vladimir, was a direct male line descendant of Tsar Alexander II. Her mother, Leonida Georgievna, was a member of the Bagration royal family, the ancient ruling dynasty of Georgia. This, Maria Vladimirovna maintains, was a marriage of equals, of 2 people from recognized royal houses, and thus their child herself possesses an unimpeachable right to the succession that other branches of the family, through their morganatic marriages, have forfeited. This assertion places her in direct conflict with the broader Romanov family association and a majority of other living descendants. Their opposition is rooted in 2 primary arguments. First, they challenge the very premise that her mother's lineage was of sufficient rank. While the Bagratians are indeed an ancient and noble dynasty, Georgia had been absorbed into the Russian Empire by the 19th century. Critics argue that by the strict standards of the Pauline laws, which were designed for European royalty, the Bagratians were no longer considered a reigning house at the time of the marriage in 1948, but rather a noble family within the Russian imperial system. This, they say, renders the marriage morganatic and excludes Maria Vladimirovna from the line of succession. Second, they reject the notion of a single head of the imperial house altogether. They view the family as a collective of equals, all worthy of honoring their shared history, but none holding a superior claim to a non-existent throne. They see her use of titles like Cesarevich for her son as anachronistic and presumptuous, a theatrical performance of authority that has no basis in the modern world. The divide was starkly illustrated by two symbolic gestures following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1992, a group of Romanov descendants visited Russia at the invitation of the government. Maria Vladimirovna pointedly refused to join them, stating that as the legitimate heir, she would only visit her homeland on her own terms, as a formal representative of the imperial house. This was seen by her detractors as a sign of arrogance and inflexibility. Then, in 1998, when the remains of the executed Romanovs were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the Yeltsin government extended an invitation to a wide array of relatives. Maria Vladimirovna again declined, believing the ceremony did not grant the family the proper respect and that the government's handling of the event was flawed. Her absence from such a historically significant moment was viewed by many as a profound miscalculation, distancing her from a pivotal act of national reconciliation. Her supporters, however, see her actions as those of a sovereign defending the dignity of her house. They are a dedicated, if smaller, group who believe that only a clear, unambiguous line of succession can preserve the principle of monarchy for a future Russia. They argue that the alternative, a sprawling family where everyone is considered equal, dilutes the very idea of legitimacy into meaninglessness. For them, Maria Vladimirovna is the sole custodian of a sacred flame, upholding standards that others have abandoned for convenience. Her life has been one of preparation for a role she may never assume, living for years in Spain and maintaining a small court that issues statements, bestows imperial honors, and engages in a quiet, persistent diplomacy aimed at keeping her claim alive. Whether seen as a righteous guardian of tradition or an isolated claimant to an irrelevant title, her story highlights the deep and personal passions that continue to swirl around the ghost of the Russian Empire, proving that the quest for a crown can be as much about the interpretation of a centuries-old law as it is about the blood running through one's veins. But all these ambitious claims, all these dreams of restored thrones and recovered glory, shared one undeniable requirement: vast, almost unimaginable amounts of money. A royal claimant without funding is merely a man with a story. They need to maintain a court in exile, travel extensively to lobby for support, commission genealogical research, fund propaganda, and present themselves in a manner befitting royalty to be taken seriously. This is where the story takes a transatlantic turn, crossing from the old world of European aristocracy to the new world of American industry, where a unique class of women emerged as the unlikely financial architects of these royal fantasies, the Gilded Age heiress. These were the daughters of America's industrial titans, railroad magnates, coal barons, and banking moguls, who had accumulated fortunes so large they rivaled the treasuries of small European nations. Names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Whitney were synonymous with wealth on an unprecedented scale. Yet, for all their financial power, these families often found themselves shut out of the highest echelons of New York society, which was still dominated by an old guard who viewed new money with deep suspicion and disdain. They had the cash, but they lacked the one thing that truly mattered in their world: status, lineage, and a title. Across the ocean, the European aristocracy faced the inverse problem. They possessed ancient bloodlines, sprawling ancestral estates, and prestigious titles. But centuries of maintaining their lifestyle had often drained their coffers dry. Their castles were crumbling, their lands were mortgaged, and their need for capital was desperate. This mutual need created a perfect, if transactional, marriage market. It became known as the dollar princess trade, a calculated exchange of New World wealth for Old World titles. For the American heiress, marrying a duke or a prince was the ultimate social triumph, an instant elevation into a world of kings and queens that no amount of money could otherwise buy. For the European nobleman, it was a financial rescue package, a way to restore a dilapidated estate, pay off generations of debt, and fund a comfortable lifestyle without having to sully their hands with something as vulgar as trade. But some of these heiresses set their sights even higher than a secure dukedom. They were drawn to the most thrilling and risky investment of all: the royal claimant. Backing a man who believed he was a king in waiting was the ultimate gamble. It offered the potential for an even greater prize, not just being a duchess, but a queen. One of the most prominent examples was Jenny Jerome, the brilliant and dynamic daughter of a wealthy New York financier. Her marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, was a classic dollar princess alliance. While the Churchill family was not claiming a throne, Jenny's substantial fortune directly funded her husband's political career, providing the financial freedom he needed to operate on the national stage. This investment, in a way, yielded the highest possible return a generation later with the rise of her son, Sir Winston Churchill. Her story illustrates the model: American money fueling British ambition. The phenomena went beyond simply funding a lifestyle. In the case of a genuine pretender, an heiress's wealth could bankroll the entire political enterprise. It could pay for the printing of pamphlets espousing their cause, fund travel to lobby foreign governments for recognition, and sponsor a court in exile that lent an air of legitimacy to their claim. The heiress became more than a wife. She was a patron, a strategist, and the chief financial officer of a royal startup. Her drawing room could become a salon where diplomats and influential figures were wooed, and her checkbook could determine whether a claimant's voice was heard or faded into obscurity. This infusion of American cash didn't just sustain these claims for another generation. It supercharged them, giving pretenders the resources to project power and credibility they otherwise would have utterly lacked. They were no longer sad exiles living on a pension. They could present themselves as sovereigns temporarily residing abroad, waiting for the right moment to return in triumph, all thanks to the fortune of a woman from New York or Pittsburgh. Of all the Gilded Age heiresses who crossed the Atlantic in search of a title, few embodied the immense power and profound personal cost of these alliances quite like Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her story is not merely one of a wealthy American girl marrying a duke. It is a stark illustration of how a single woman's fortune, and by extension her life, could be leveraged as capital to rebuild an entire aristocratic dynasty and fuel its political aspirations. Born into unimaginable wealth as the only daughter of railroad tycoon William Kissam Vanderbilt, and the formidable social climber Alva Vanderbilt. Consulo was raised from childhood for one singular purpose: to secure the highest possible position in the old world hierarchy. Her mother, Alva, was a ruthless strategist in the social wars of New York, and she saw in her beautiful, cultured daughter the ultimate weapon to defeat the old guard who had once snubbed her. Consulo's life was meticulously engineered for this role, from her education in European languages and etiquette to her tightly controlled social interactions. The target of Alva's ambition was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in England, but his eligibility was not based on his bank account. The Duke, often known as Sonny for his title rather than his disposition, was the master of Blenheim Palace, a monumental Baroque masterpiece in the ancestral home of the Churchill family. Yet, this magnificent palace was a crushing financial burden. The estate was vast, the maintenance costs were astronomical, and the family fortunes had been in steady decline. The Duke needed a miracle, and in the Gilded Age, miracles came in the form of American heiresses with bottomless purses. The marriage negotiations were brutally pragmatic. Alva Vanderbilt, by some accounts, essentially brokered a deal. Her daughter's hand in marriage and a staggering dowry reported to be in the vicinity of $2.5 million, equivalent to over $75 million today, in exchange for a duchess's coronet and the salvation of Blenheim Palace. For the Duke, this fortune was not merely a means to repair leaking roofs and shore up crumbling masonry. It was the essential fuel for his own royal adjacent ambitions. While not a claimant to a throne himself, the Duke of Marlborough occupied a rarefied space within the British aristocracy, a circle that constantly interacted with and influenced the royal family. His wealth, now restored by Vanderbilt money, granted him the political and social capital to operate at the highest levels. He could now afford to run for office, host influential political figures at his restored estate, and maintain a lifestyle that commanded respect and conferred authority. The Vanderbilt millions effectively purchased him a seat at the table of power, allowing him to engage in the grand political games of the era. His status as a wealthy duke, thanks to Consulo, made him a more significant player in the networks that surrounded the British throne, and by extension, the complex web of European royalty. For Consulo, however, the reality of her new life was one of profound loneliness and golden oppression. Her marriage was famously unhappy from the start. It was reported she wept throughout the wedding ceremony. She was a stranger in a cold, imposing palace, married to a man who showed her little affection and who was primarily devoted to the preservation of his lineage and estate. Her role was to produce an heir, which she did, and to perform the duties of a duchess with grace and beauty, which she also did impeccably. Yet, her personal misery was the direct price paid for the financial and social stability of the Marlborough line. In a cruel twist, the very wealth that made her so valuable also rendered her a prisoner of the title it had bought. She became the archetype of the dollar princess, a tragic figure whose personal fulfillment was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Despite her personal unhappiness, Consulo's fortune did more than just restore a palace. It revitalized a bloodline. The Churchill family, and by extension their cousins, were now financially secure and could continue to play their part in the nation's leadership. This stability had ripple effects throughout the aristocratic world, reinforcing the system that other claimants and nobles depended upon for patronage and alliance. The Marlboroughs, backed by Vanderbilt gold, were once again a formidable force, their influence echoing in the halls of power where the fates of empires and pretenderships were often decided. Consulo's story, perhaps more than any other, exemplifies the immense transactional power of the Gilded Age heiress. She was the human embodiment of a multi-million-dollar bailout, a woman whose heartbreak funded the dreams of dukes and helped maintain the very architecture of European aristocracy for another generation. And so we come to the tale of Anna Good, a story that perfectly encapsulates the intricate dance between American wealth and European titles, but with a uniquely dramatic twist of personal revenge and dynastic ambition that even the most creative novelist would envy. Anna was not the most celebrated beauty of her era, but she possessed an asset far more compelling in the marriage market. She was the youngest daughter of the infamous railroad robber Baron J. Good, one of the wealthiest and most ruthless men in America. Upon his death, she inherited a portion of his colossal fortune, an amount so vast it immediately made her one of the most sought-after heiresses on 2 continents. Her life, however, would become a stark lesson in the difference between buying a title and acquiring the life that should come with it. Her first foray into matrimony was a spectacular, glittering mistake. At the age of 19, she was swept off her feet by the dazzlingly handsome and fabulously charming Count Marie Ernest Paul Boniface de Castellane, known to everyone as Boney. He was a scion of one of France's oldest and most illustrious families, a man whose sole occupation in life was the pursuit of beauty, luxury, and extravagant entertainment. He was in every sense a professional aristocrat. For Boney, Anna's fortune was not a supplement to his life. It was the entire point of his existence. He embarked on a spending spree of legendary proportions, using her money to purchase priceless antiques, build a magnificent pink marble mansion on Paris's Avenue du Bois, and host lavish parties that became the talk of Europe. He spent her inheritance with a breathtaking lack of concern, treating the good millions as his personal piggy bank to fund a fantasy life of limitless opulence. Anna, quiet and less socially assured, found herself trapped in a gilded cage, playing the role of financier to a husband who saw her as little more than a necessary accessory to his grandeur. The marriage was, unsurprisingly, a disaster. After 12 years and 2 sons, Anna had endured enough of Boney's reckless extravagance and numerous infidelities. She divorced him in 1906, a scandalous act for the time that required immense personal courage. In a stunning blow to his pride, the French courts awarded her a significant portion of her remaining fortune back, leaving Boney financially diminished and publicly humiliated. But Anna's story was far from over. In a move that shocked society, she soon after married Boney's cousin, Prince Haley de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duke of Talleyrand and Duke of Sagan. This was not merely a new marriage. It was a profound and calculated social realignment. By marrying into the Talleyrand family, Anna was connecting herself to one of the most cunning and diplomatic dynasties in European history. But more importantly, she was weaving her fortune directly into the very heart of Bonapartist imperial ambition. The Talleyrand's were deeply enmeshed with the Bonaparte family's persistent dream of restoring the French Empire. Haley's uncle, the legendary Prince of Talleyrand, had been a key architect of French politics for decades, and the family remained central to monarchist circles. Anna's immense wealth, now firmly under the control of a more prudent and strategically minded husband, became the essential financial engine for these pretensions. Where Boney had spent her money on parties and palaces, Haley and the Bonapartist clique would invest it in a political cause. The funds were used to maintain a court in exile, finance propaganda efforts, support sympathetic political candidates, and ensure that the Bonapartist claimant to the French throne could live and operate with the dignity and influence expected of a potential emperor. Anna Good's dollars, refined through the sophisticated filter of the Talleyrand name, provided the Bonaparte cause with a level of financial stability and social credibility it had lacked for a generation. In a final, exquisite twist of fate, Anna's two sons from her first marriage, Boney's own children, were brought into this new, powerful Talleyrand Bonapartist fold. They were raised within the very dynasty their biological father's family had aspired to be part of. Their futures now tied to the imperial ambitions Anna was bankrolling with the fortune Boney had failed to squander completely. She had taken back control of her money and her life, and in doing so, she had elevated herself from the abused wife of a spendthrift count to the matriarchal banker of a would-be imperial house. Anna Good's journey demonstrates the ultimate power a Gilded Age heiress could wield, not just to buy a title, but to strategically deploy her wealth to shape political legacies, avenge personal slights, and secure a lasting influence that would extend far beyond the ballroom and into the halls of power. While the Vanderbilts and Goods were busy financing European ambitions, another fascinating fusion of aristocracy and aspiration was unfolding under the bright Indian sun, centered around one of the most powerful British families in the empire. The Curzon sisters, daughters of the formidable Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, found themselves at the very heart of this intersection between British imperial authority and India's ancient princely states. Their story is not one of American dollars buying European titles, but rather of British blue blood intertwining with the immense wealth and complex political status of India's royal claimants during the twilight of the British Raj and the tumultuous dawn of independence. Their father, Lord Curzon, was the living embodiment of British imperial power in India. As Viceroy from 1899 to 1905, he was arguably the most powerful man on the subcontinent, ruling over hundreds of millions of subjects and presiding with absolute authority over the 562 princely states. These states were ruled by Indian Maharajas, Nawabs, and Nizams, who had accepted British paramountcy in exchange for local autonomy. Curzon's relationship with these princes was one of paternalistic control. He saw himself as the guardian of their traditions while simultaneously ensuring their loyalty to the British crown. He raised his three daughters, Irene, Cynthia, and Alexandra, in the rarefied, almost surreal opulence of the viceregal lodge, where they were treated like princesses in their own right, surrounded by the pageantry and power of the Raj. They grew up viewing these magnificent Indian princes not as exotic curiosities, but as familiar figures in their father's court, men of immense wealth, culture, and political significance. It was the youngest daughter, Lady Alexandra Curzon, who would form the most direct and controversial link to this world. In 1922, she made a stunning decision that sent shockwaves through British high society. She accepted a proposal of marriage from Prince Azam Jah, the eldest son and presumed heir of the richest man in the world, Mir Osman Ali Khan, the Nizam of Hyderabad. This was not a simple aristocratic union. It was a seismic event that blurred the lines between ruler and subject, colonizer and colonized. The Nizam was an absolute monarch within his own vast domain, a state the size of the United Kingdom itself. He was a Muslim ruler over a predominantly Hindu population, and his wealth was legendary, famously using a colossal diamond as a paperweight. For the family of a former viceroy to marry into this family was unprecedented. It was a recognition, however tacit, of the Nizam's sovereign status, a move that many in the British establishment viewed as a breathtaking breach of racial and political protocol. The marriage thrust Lady Alexandra, now known as Princess Darushavar, into the very center of a high-stakes succession drama. Her husband, Azam Jah, was not a guaranteed heir. The Nizam's succession plans were notoriously complex and fraught with tension. The old Nizam, a deeply conservative and unpredictable figure, had another son from a different wife, Prince Mozam Jah, who was equally positioned to inherit the throne. This created a fierce, silent rivalry between the two branches of the family, each with their own courtiers and supporters. By marrying Azam Jah, Alexandra Curzon had inadvertently become a key player in this internal struggle for the future of Hyderabad. Her presence lent her husband's faction a certain prestige and a tangible connection to the highest echelons of the former imperial power, a subtle form of political capital in a deeply uncertain time. Her sister, Lady Irene Curzon, further deepened the family's entanglement with India's fading royalty. Irene married a dashing Irish peer, but her life took a tragic turn when she was widowed young. She later formed a deep and lifelong attachment to the Maharaja of Jaipur, a charismatic and modernizing ruler, becoming a central figure in his social circle and a frequent visitor to his magnificent court. While not a formal marriage, this close association linked another Curzon daughter to the destiny of a major princely state, reinforcing the family's unique role as bridges between the British aristocracy and India's royal families. The ultimate test of these alliances came with Indian independence in 1947. The new Indian government, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, was determined to integrate the princely states into the unified republic. Most princes acceded peacefully, but the Nizam of Hyderabad, encouraged by his court and the sheer size of his domain, harbored ambitions for complete independence or accession to Pakistan. This led to a tense standoff and finally a brief but violent military intervention by the Indian Army in 1948, known as the Police Action, which forcibly integrated Hyderabad into India. For Princess Darushavar, the former Alexandra Curzon, this was a personal and political calamity. The throne her husband might have inherited vanished overnight. She found herself the consort of a prince without a principality, her status reduced from that of a future queen to that of a wealthy but powerless aristocrat in a new democratic nation. The legacy of the Curzon sisters in India is a complex tapestry of personal romance and political irony. They had entered these unions from a position of perceived strength, as daughters of the mighty viceroy. Yet, within a generation, the imperial power structure their father represented had completely dissolved, and the princely titles they had married into were abolished by the Indian government. Their stories represent the final, glittering chapter of a unique historical moment, a brief period where the British aristocracy and the Indian royalty met as relative equals, bound by mutual fascination, immense wealth, and a shared, though ultimately doomed, belief in the permanence of their privileged world. They became living symbols of a transition, their personal lives reflecting the larger, dramatic handover of power from a collection of kings in an empire to a single, modern republic. Yet another royal claim would emerge not from the dusty archives of mainland Europe, but from the most unlikely of places, the sun-baked Australian outback. This story centers on a man named Michael Abnai Hastings, who for most of his life was simply Mike Hastings, a quiet, unassuming rice farmer from the rural town of Jerilderie, New South Wales. His existence was a world away from palaces and court intrigue, focused instead on crops and the harsh realities of farming life. That all changed in 2004 when a groundbreaking British documentary series, Britain's Real Monarch, turned its spotlight on him, presenting a meticulously researched argument that this ordinary Australian farmer was, in fact, the rightful king of Scotland, and by extension, the legitimate heir to the entire English throne. The premise was as audacious as it was captivating, suggesting that the entire course of British history had been based on a centuries-old usurpation. The argument hinged on a radical reinterpretation of a pivotal moment in English history, the succession crisis following the death of King Edward IV in 1483. The traditional history books tell us that his 12-year-old son was crowned Edward V, only for him and his younger brother to famously disappear into the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, then seized the crown himself, becoming King Richard III. The documentary, however, put forward a different, more scandalous theory. It suggested that the entire narrative of the princes in the tower was a brilliant piece of political propaganda designed to cover up a far more explosive secret. The claim was that the young Edward V was actually illegitimate, the product of an affair between his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and another man. If true, this would have invalidated his claim to the throne from the very beginning, making his younger brother Richard the true heir. But Richard, the younger prince, also died in the tower. So if both boys were out of the picture, who should have been next in line? This is where the story connects to Mike Hastings in Australia. The program argued that the legitimate heir at that moment was not Richard III, but George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, the older brother of both Edward IV and Richard III. Clarence had been executed for treason years earlier, supposedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine on the orders of his own brother, the king, but he left behind a son and a daughter. The son, Edward, Earl of Warwick, was eventually executed by Henry VII to eliminate a rival claim. The daughter, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was later executed by Henry VIII. But before her death, Margaret had a son. This son held a title that is the crucial link in this entire chain, the Earl of Huntingdon. The documentary's researchers traced a direct, unbroken line of descent from this Earl of Huntingdon, down through centuries of English nobility, all the way to Mike Hastings's mother, who was the daughter of the 15th Earl of Huntingdon. Upon the death of the 15th Earl without a male heir, the documentary asserted that the title and the dormant claim to the throne should have passed not to a distant cousin, but through his daughter's line, directly to her son, Michael Abnai Hastings. Overnight, the unassuming farmer was thrust into an international media frenzy. Newspapers dubbed him the King of the Outback and the real monarch. He was flown to London, filmed walking through the Tower of London and looking thoughtfully at the crown jewels. He handled the media attention with a characteristic dry wit and a distinct lack of pretension, often seeming bemused by the entire situation. He never actively campaigned for the throne or demanded recognition. He simply acknowledged the interesting historical theory. He did, however, adopt the courtesy title of Lord Hastings and later Prince Michael of Albany, a title connected to ancient Scottish kingship, which he used for the remainder of his life. His sudden fame turned him into a minor celebrity and sparked lively debates in living rooms and online forums about the nature of legitimacy and the twists of hereditary succession. However, this compelling narrative faced significant and authoritative pushback from professional historians and genealogists. The central pillar of the claim, the illegitimacy of Edward IV, is, and will always remain, an unproven theory based on circumstantial evidence from the 15th century. There are no surviving documents that definitively prove the allegation, which was a common tactic used to discredit political enemies in the medieval period. Furthermore, even if one accepts the theory, the descent through the Earl of Huntingdon line is fraught with complications. The rules of aristocratic title succession in England are incredibly specific and almost always passed through the male line, a principle known as agnatic primogeniture. The Earldom of Huntingdon did not, in fact, pass to Mike Hastings's mother. It went to a distant male cousin, a fact that fundamentally undermines the legalistic argument for his claim. Most historians view the documentary as a brilliant piece of entertaining historical speculation rather than a serious academic argument. A what-if scenario that made for fantastic television, but had little basis in established heraldic law. The story of Prince Michael of Albany is perhaps the perfect modern pretender tale for the media age. It did not rely on military power or political conspiracy, but on the power of a compelling story told through a mass media platform. It demonstrated how a television program could elevate a historical footnote into a global conversation, blurring the lines between documentary evidence and entertainment. Mike Hastings himself passed away in 2012, but his unusual story continues to capture the imagination. It serves as a reminder that history is not always a settled record, but a series of narratives, and that sometimes the most powerful claim to a crown isn't held by the one who wears it, but by the one who has the most fascinating story to tell. The collapse of the Yugoslav monarchy after World War II did not erase the royal line from history. Instead, it set the stage for a deeply personal and very public family dispute that continues to this day. The Karađorđević dynasty, which had unified the South Slavs and ruled the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, found itself in a bitter and protracted exile. For decades, the family was banned from returning to a homeland that had become a communist state under Marshal Tito. It was not until the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s in the fall of Slobodan Milošević that the door cracked open for a potential royal return. This dramatic shift in the political landscape did not, however, lead to a simple family reunion. Instead, it exposed and intensified a long, simmering rivalry over who rightfully holds the legacy of the dynasty, a conflict that now pits a father against his son in a struggle for the very soul of the royal claim. At the center of this story is Prince Alexander II, the only son of the last reigning king, Peter II. Born in exile in a suite at Claridge's Hotel in London that was temporarily declared Yugoslav territory, Alexander has spent his entire life championing the cause of restoration. Following the democratic changes in Serbia, he and his family returned to Belgrade in 2001 and were granted the use of the royal compound, the former royal residence. For over 2 decades, he has skillfully positioned himself as a non-political unifying figure, a symbol of a democratic Serbia that could look beyond the ethnic divisions and painful memories of the 20th century. He engages in constant public diplomacy, meeting with foreign ambassadors, hosting cultural events at the palace, and speaking of national reconciliation. His approach is one of soft persuasion, aiming to demonstrate the value of a constitutional monarchy through service and presence, rather than through political demands. His vision, however, is directly and publicly challenged by his eldest son, Prince Philip. The rift became impossible to ignore in 2017, when Philip issued a startling declaration. He did not merely express a difference of opinion. He formally rejected his father's leadership and proclaimed himself the head of the royal house and the rightful heir. This was not a quiet family disagreement, but a direct and formal challenge to his father's authority. Prince Philip's argument hinges on a strict, traditionalist interpretation of dynastic law. He asserts that his parents' marriage was not dynastic, meaning it did not receive the necessary approval from the head of the house, his grandfather, King Peter II, as required by the family statutes. Because of this, he argues, his father's entire branch of the family is in a sense morganatic, and thus the rightful claim should have passed to the next eligible male heir, which he believes is himself as the eldest grandson of the king through a different, approved line. This legalistic argument is deeply layered with personal and historical complexities. Prince Alexander married Princess Maria da Glória of Orléans-Bragança, a descendant of the Brazilian imperial family and the French royal house, a union many considered highly suitable. The central question revolves around whether King Peter II, who died in 1970, ever gave his formal written consent to the marriage, a document that has never been publicly produced. Alexander's supporters argue the king's blessing was given verbally, and that the marriage's obvious appropriateness makes the requirement a formality. Philip's supporters treat this missing document as the cornerstone of their entire case, the single piece of paperwork that they believe invalidates his father's claim and elevates his own. The fallout from this schism has been significant. The Serbian public, which already holds mixed views on the relevance of the monarchy, is presented with a divided royal family, a spectacle that undoubtedly weakens the overall restoration movement. Monarchist organizations are forced to choose sides, fragmenting a base that was already a minority. The international media, always fascinated by royal scandals, portrays the dispute as a Shakespearean drama of ambition and betrayal, further complicating the family's efforts to be taken seriously as a modern institution. Prince Philip maintains his own court, grants his own interviews, and issues his own statements, creating a parallel narrative of legitimacy that directly competes with his father's established presence in Belgrade. This creates a confusing picture for those outside the family, where there are effectively two men claiming to be the rightful king of the same country. Beyond the legal documents and public proclamations, this conflict represents a fundamental clash of generations and ideologies. Prince Alexander represents the path of integration and pragmatism. He is physically present in Serbia, working within the existing republican framework to build goodwill and demonstrate the value a royal family could bring as a stabilizing force above politics. His son, Prince Philip, represents a more rigid, principle-based approach. From his home in the United States, he champions a return to strict dynastic tradition, arguing that the monarchy cannot be restored on a foundation of compromised rules, no matter how well-intentioned the efforts. It is a battle between the practical realities of modern nation-building and the unwavering adherence to ancient laws, a dispute that ensures the Karađorđević name remains in the headlines, not for unifying a nation, but for a family divided against itself. While the Serbian royal family grapples with internal divisions, another European monarch made a return from exile so remarkable it defies any fictional comparison. The story of Šimon Saxe-Coburg, Gotha, is a singular chapter in modern history, the incredible tale of a man who ascended to his throne as a young boy, lost his crown to communist revolution, spent 5 decades in exile, and then returned to his homeland not to reclaim his title, but to be elected its head of government. His journey from child king to democratic prime minister represents one of the most fascinating and successful reinventions of royal identity in the 20th century. Šimon's extraordinary life began under the darkest of clouds. He was just 6 years old when his father, the beloved King Boris III, died under suspicious circumstances in 1943 after returning from a tense meeting with Adolf Hitler. Overnight, the young boy was thrust onto the throne as Tsar Šimon II, with a council of regents ruling in his name. For a child, the weight of a nation at war was an impossible burden. The political situation was a treacherous tightrope. Bulgaria was officially allied with the Axis powers, but had refused to deport its Jewish population, an act of defiance that saved nearly 50,000 lives. As the war turned against Germany, the Soviet Union declared war on Bulgaria and quickly occupied the country. The regents were overthrown and executed, and in 1946, a Soviet-controlled referendum officially abolished the monarchy. The 9-year-old king, along with his mother and sister, was forced to flee into an uncertain exile. The next 50 years of his life were a masterclass in adapting to a world that had seemingly passed him by. The family eventually settled in Spain, where Šimon was educated, and later built a successful career in business and finance. He became Šimon Saxe-Coburg, Gotha, a respected businessman and family man, but he never forgot his roots or his sense of duty to Bulgaria. He scrupulously avoided the intrigues of exile politics, refusing to engage in feudal plotting or to declare a government in exile. Instead, he watched and waited, maintaining a quiet but persistent connection to the dissident movements and the shifting political winds back home. This patience proved to be his greatest strategic asset. When the Iron Curtain finally fell in 1989, he was one of the first former heads of state to visit the new democratic Bulgaria, receiving a hero's welcome from citizens who still remembered the monarchy with deep affection. Rather than demanding the restoration of his crown, Simon chose a far more audacious and modern path. In 2001, after the Bulgarian economy had cratered and public trust in the political class had evaporated, he announced his intention to return to Bulgaria permanently and form a new political movement. He launched the National Movement for Stability and Progress, often known simply as Simon the Second National Movement. His campaign was not built on nostalgia for the monarchy, but on a platform of economic reform, anti-corruption measures, and European integration. He presented himself not as a returning king, but as a seasoned professional with international experience who could clean up the mess created by career politicians. To a population weary of poverty and graft, his message was powerfully compelling. In a stunning political earthquake, his movement won a landslide victory in the parliamentary elections, and he was appointed Prime Minister of the Republic of Bulgaria. His time in office was a complex blend of triumph and challenge, a constant negotiation between his royal past and his democratic present. He never used his royal title in an official capacity, yet his regal bearing and personal history were an inescapable part of his political identity. He moved into the former royal palace, now the seat of government, a symbolic return that was rich with historical irony. His government achieved significant successes, notably securing Bulgaria's invitation to join NATO and beginning the arduous negotiations for European Union membership. However, the lofty expectations he had set proved difficult to meet. The difficult economic reforms required by the EU and IMF led to widespread dissatisfaction, and by the next election, his party's support had dwindled. He served a full term, but was unable to replicate his initial electoral magic. The legacy of Simon Saxe-Coburg Gotha is a profound lesson in the evolving nature of royalty in a democratic age. He demonstrated that a monarch's most valuable currency is not a crown, but legitimacy earned through service and respect for the will of the people. By choosing the ballot box over a hollow claim to the throne, he granted himself a political authority that no title alone could bestow. Even after leaving office, he remained a respected elder statesman in Bulgarian politics, his unique status forever marking him as a living bridge between the nation's storied past and its European future. His story proves that sometimes the most powerful way to honor a royal legacy is not by clinging to a vacant throne, but by stepping into the political arena and earning the people's trust all over again. This bitter dynastic dispute brings us to another royal house fractured by internal rivalry, where the battle for a phantom crown has pitted cousin against cousin in a very public and deeply personal feud. The story of the Italian House of Savoy presents a uniquely modern royal scandal, one where the contentious issue isn't just about ancient laws, but about the very character and actions of the claimants themselves in the 20th century. The roots of this schism stretch back to the final, tumultuous days of the Italian monarchy. In 1946, following the fall of Mussolini and the end of World War II, a deeply scarred nation held a referendum to decide its future. King Umberto II, who had reigned for just 34 days after his father's abdication, desperately campaigned to save the crown, but the result was devastatingly close. The monarchy was abolished by a narrow margin, and Umberto, bitterly protesting the result, but unwilling to plunge the country into civil war, left Italy for a permanent exile in Portugal. He would become known as the May King for his brief reign, and his departure marked the beginning of a family's long struggle with irrelevance and internal strife. The controversy that would eventually split the family wide open did not begin with Umberto, but with his father, King Victor Emmanuel III. His reign was one of the longest in modern history, but it was also profoundly controversial. It was under his watch that Benito Mussolini came to power, and while the king eventually dismissed Il Duce in 1943, his earlier acquiescence to the fascist regime, including his signing of the notorious racial laws that targeted Italy's Jewish population, left a dark and lasting stain on the Savoy name. His decision to flee Rome as the German army approached further damaged his prestige. In a final, desperate attempt to save the monarchy, he transferred his powers to his son, Umberto, in 1944 and formally abdicated in his favor just weeks before the 1946 referendum. This move was intended to present a clean break with the recent, tarnished past, but for many Italians, the damage was already done. The sins of the father would go on to haunt the claims of his descendants for generations. The modern dispute centers on two men, both descendants of Victor Emmanuel III, but from different branches of the family. On one side is the late Prince Vittorio Emmanuel, Umberto II's only son. As the son of the last reigning king, he represented the main line of succession and considered himself the uncontested head of the House of Savoy from his father's death in 1983. However, his reputation was a constant source of problems for the monarchist cause. His life was marred by scandal, most infamously a 1978 incident where he was accused of accidentally killing a young German man, Dirk Hamer, with a rifle shot from his yacht off the coast of Corsica. After a lengthy legal process across multiple countries, he was ultimately acquitted of manslaughter, but the shadow of the tragedy never left him. His brash personality and past entanglements made him a deeply polarizing figure, even among those who might have otherwise supported a royal restoration. Challenging his position was his cousin, Prince Amedeo, Duke of Aosta. Amedeo descended from a junior branch of the Savoy family through Prince Amedeo, the third Duke of Aosta, who was a first cousin of King Victor Emmanuel III. The Aosta line had always been popular in Italy, seen as more modest, morally upright, and less tainted by association with the fascist era. Prince Amedeo himself was a respected figure, a former banker who carried himself with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to his cousin's flashy and controversial lifestyle. The legal argument for his claim is intricate and hinges on a marital technicality. Amedeo's supporters argue that Vittorio Emmanuel's marriage to Marina Doria in 1971 was morganatic, meaning she was not of equal royal rank according to the house's own dynastic laws. They contend that because the marriage was not approved by the head of the house, Umberto II, as required by the Savoyard house laws, Vittorio Emmanuel's son, Prince Emmanuel Filiberto, was born from a union that did not comply with the rules of succession thus excluding that entire branch from the line. This disagreement exploded into public view in 2006, when both sides took the extraordinary step of issuing competing manifestos, each signed by various nobles and theorists, declaring their man the true head of the royal house. The feud became shockingly personal, descending into a war of words played out in the press, and even a physical altercation during a royal gala in Spain, where the two cousins had to be separated after a heated argument. The bitterness of this division severely hampered any remote chance of a monarchist revival in Italy. How could a movement persuade a nation to return to a system of hereditary leadership when the very family proposing to lead could not even agree on which member was the rightful heir? The Italian public, largely indifferent or opposed to the monarchy, watched this unseemly squabble with a mixture of amusement and disdain, seeing it as confirmation that the royal house was a relic of a bygone era, incapable of presenting a unified or dignified front. The passing of both principal claimants, Prince Vittorio Emanuele in 2024 and Prince Amedeo in 2021, has not resolved the issue. It has merely passed the baton to the next generation. Vittorio Emanuele's son, Emanuele Filiberto, now asserts his position as head of the house, while Amedeo's son, Prince Aimone, Duke of Apulia, continues his father's claim. Prince Aimone, who works for a major Italian tire company, has even been adopted as a candidate by some monarchist groups who see in him a more serious and credible figure. This enduring split serves as a powerful lesson in how legacy is not just about bloodline, but also about perception and conduct. The Savoy dispute demonstrates that in the modern world, where royalty survives on soft power and public affection, a tarnished reputation and a fractured family can be far more damaging to a claim than any act of parliament or referendum. The crown they fight over may be gone, but the passion of their quarrel proves that the allure of royal legacy remains potent, even when it divides a house against itself. Far from the ancient dynastic struggles of Europe lies a claim born from a brief and tragic experiment in empire building, a story that connects the highlands of Austria to the heart of Mexico. The tale of the Mexican imperial claimants begins not with a centuries-old lineage, but with a single, idealistic, and ultimately doomed figure, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria. Younger brother of the formidable Emperor Franz Joseph, Maximilian was a man of liberal inclinations and romantic dreams, which made him the perfect candidate for an audacious scheme orchestrated by Mexican conservative elites and the French Emperor Napoleon III. After a French invasion toppled the Mexican Republic, these groups offered Maximilian a throne he never knew he wanted. Against his family's advice and with promises of popular support that proved to be a mirage, he and his wife, the Belgian Princess Charlotte, arrived in Mexico in 1864 to rule as Emperor Maximilian I and Empress Carlota. His reign was a study in contradictions. A European aristocrat who genuinely tried to embrace his new country, he championed liberal reforms that often alienated the very conservative factions that had invited him. He refused to repeal the progressive laws that had secularized church property, instantly making powerful enemies within the Catholic clergy. All the while, the legitimate Republican government of Benito Juarez waged a relentless guerrilla war against the French occupation and his imperial rule. The entire venture collapsed when Napoleon III, facing pressure from the United States and the rising power of Prussia, withdrew his military support. Abandoned and besieged, Maximilian was captured by Republican forces. Despite impassioned pleas for clemency from royalty across Europe, he was executed by firing squad in 1867, a stark and brutal end to Mexico's Second Empire. He died without any biological children, which immediately created a succession crisis for a throne that had ceased to exist. This is where the story of the claimants truly begins. With no direct heir, the question of who would inherit his legacy fell to the complex rules of European dynastic law. Maximilian was a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs had meticulously detailed house laws governing succession. According to these rules, upon his death, his rights and titles would typically pass to the next senior male in his family, his brother, Emperor Franz Joseph. But Franz Joseph, who had opposed the Mexican adventure from the start, had no interest in a defunct title from a failed state. He formally renounced any claim for himself and his direct descendants. This act did not erase the title, however. It merely pushed the potential claim down the line of the extensive Habsburg family tree to the cadet branches and more distant cousins. The claim to this phantom Mexican throne therefore became intertwined with the succession of the Austrian Empire itself. Following the collapse of Austria-Hungary after World War I and the abolition of noble titles in the new republic, the Habsburg family continued to observe their traditional house laws in exile. The head of the house is considered the bearer of all dynastic rights, including any dormant or extinct titles from the family's history. This means that for much of the 20th century, the claim to the Mexican imperial title was held by the heads of the House of Habsburg, first by Otto von Habsburg, the last crown prince of Austria-Hungary, and then upon his death in 2011, by his eldest son, Karl von Habsburg. In this view, the title is not a separate entity, but a historical appendage of the Habsburg legacy, a curious footnote to their main claim. However, another fascinating and more direct line of descent exists, not through blood, but through adoption. Before leaving for Mexico, Maximilian and Carlota adopted two grandsons of the first Mexican emperor, Agustin de Iturbide. The boys, Agustin and Salvador Iturbide, were given the title of Prince de Iturbide and were formally designated as potential heirs to the Mexican throne in the absence of any natural-born children from the imperial couple. Following Maximilian's execution, the young Iturbide princes were sent to Europe. While their direct descendants have largely lived private lives, some have occasionally been put forward by small monarchist circles in Mexico as having a more Mexican claim to the imperial legacy, one rooted in the country's own history rather than solely in European aristocracy. This creates a subtle, though largely symbolic, rivalry of legitimacy between the adopted Iturbide line and the dynastic Habsburg line. Today, the claim is a quiet but persistent part of the Habsburgs' immense historical portfolio. Karl von Habsburg, as the current head of the house, is the individual whom serious monarchist theorists would point to as the de jure claimant. Yet, he is a pragmatic modern man, a politician and advocate for European cultural heritage who is focused on the future, not on reviving the lost titles of the past. He has never publicly asserted a claim to the Mexican throne, understanding it as a historical artifact rather than a political reality. The cause is kept alive not by the family itself, but by a niche group of enthusiasts and romantic historians, primarily in Mexico and Europe. These groups occasionally gather, publish articles, and discuss the fascinating what-if scenarios of a continued Mexican monarchy, often drawing symbolic connections between Maximilian's liberal ideals and modern governance. Their support, while minuscule, speaks to the enduring power of royal mystique. For these monarchists, the figure of Maximilian represents a path not taken, a Mexico that could have been a stable constitutional monarchy closely aligned with Europe. They see his execution as a national tragedy that ushered in decades of instability. The claim, for them, is less about a desire to install a Habsburg archduke in Mexico City and more about keeping alive an alternative vision of Mexican history, a symbol of a different political tradition that stands in contrast to the republicanism that ultimately prevailed. It is a claim that exists almost entirely in the realm of historical discussion and sentimental allegiance, a ghost of a 19th century dream that continues to whisper, however faintly, across the Atlantic. The story of Hawaii's lost monarchy is one of the most poignant and politically charged royal claims in the modern world, a narrative not of ancient European dynasties, but of a thriving Pacific kingdom violently overthrown with the direct assistance of a foreign power. Unlike the exiles of Europe, the descendants of the Hawaiian royal family did not watch their throne vanish from a distant shore. They witnessed its destruction on their own soil, an act that continues to resonate through generations and fuels a powerful sovereignty movement to this day. The Hawaiian kingdom was a recognized independent nation with a modern constitution, diplomatic embassies, and a beloved monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. Her overthrow in 1893 by a group of American and European sugar planters and businessmen, backed by the threat of U.S. Marines, was not a popular revolution, but a blatant act of imperialism. The Queen, to avoid bloodshed, temporarily yielded her authority not to the conspirators, but to the United States government itself, trusting that President Cleveland's administration would investigate and correct the injustice. This trust was profoundly betrayed, despite President Cleveland's own condemnation of the act as an act of war and his call for the Queen to be restored. Powerful economic interests in Washington prevailed. The temporary provisional government became a republic, and in 1898, the United States formally annexed Hawaii, extinguishing its sovereignty for over half a century. In the vacuum left by the overthrow, the question of rightful leadership did not disappear. It fractured, creating a complex and sometimes contentious landscape of claims and aspirations centered on the extensive descendants of the two royal families that unified the islands, the House of Kamehameha and the House of Kalakaua. The last reigning monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, died in 1917 without direct heirs, but she was preceded by her brother, King David Kalakaua. Both siblings had numerous cousins, and their descendants formed the core of the modern-day alii, or chiefly, families who carry the legacy of the monarchy. There is no single, universally recognized pretender to the Hawaiian throne. Instead, several individuals and family groups are often put forward by different factions within the broader sovereignty movement, each with their own interpretation of lineage and legitimacy. One of the most prominent figures in recent decades was the late Abigail Kekaulike Kawananakoa, a direct descendant of both the Kalakaua line and the pre-unification High Chiefs of Maui. As a child, she was even declared an heir presumptive by Queen Liliuokalani herself, though the legal weight of that declaration is debated. For years, Princess Abigail, as she was popularly known, was a towering figure in Hawaiian society. Her immense wealth, derived from a trust linked to her great-grandfather James Campbell, allowed her to act as a modern-day patron of the arts and culture, funding scholarships, preserving historical documents, and acquiring priceless Hawaiian artifacts to return them to the island. She lived a life of regal bearing, maintaining a presence that kept the idea of the monarchy vividly alive in the public imagination. However, her later years were clouded by a very public legal battle over her estate, which revealed deep divisions within her own family and highlighted the challenges of merging modern legal battles with traditional concepts of succession. Her passing in 2022 left a significant void and intensified the discussion over who might now carry the symbolic mantle. Another lineage with a strong claim descends from the House of Kamehameha, the dynasty of the great king who first unified the Hawaiian island. The Kamehameha line is considered by many to be the senior and most prestigious line, but it faced a succession crisis long before the overthrow. The last direct descendant of Kamehameha, the great Prince Albert Kanuiakia, died in 1903 without officially designated heirs, though he did have children. This has led to various individuals over the years asserting a connection to this revered bloodline. The arguments here are often deeply enmeshed in Hawaiian genealogical traditions, or maokahau, which places immense importance on tracing one's ancestry back to the most senior and sacred roots. For many Native Hawaiians, legitimacy is not just a matter of European-style primogeniture. It is about the spiritual and cultural weight of one's entire genealogy and their demonstrated commitment to the Lahui, the Hawaiian people. This brings us to the heart of the modern movement, which is far less about installing a literal king or queen and far more about the ongoing struggle for national sovereignty and self-determination. The various royal societies and trusts, such as the Royal Order of Kamehameha the First or the Ahahui Kahumanu, work to preserve the customs and protocols of the monarchy, but their ultimate goal is the restoration of the nation itself. The debate over a potential head of state is often secondary to the larger political objectives. Some groups advocate for complete independence from the United States, while others work toward federal recognition for a Native Hawaiian governing entity, similar to the government-to-government relationship the U.S. has with Native American tribes. Within this framework, the role of a monarch is often envisioned as a constitutional, ceremonial figure, unifying symbol of cultural rebirth and national identity rather than an absolute ruler. The path to any form of restoration is fraught with immense legal and political hurdles. The U.S. government has issued official apologies for its role in the overthrow, most notably with the Apology Resolution of 1993, signed by President Clinton on the 100th anniversary of the event. This document acknowledges the illegal nature of the overthrow and the U.S. role in it, but it stops short of offering any concrete reparations or a path to restoration. The fight continues in courts, in the halls of the state legislature in Honolulu, and in the hearts of the Hawaiian people. The descendants of the alii continue to navigate this difficult terrain, balancing their sacred familial kuleana or responsibility with the practical realities of modern politics. Theirs is a claim steeped not in the pageantry of European exile, but in the ongoing pain of occupation and the resilient hope that the spirit of the Hawaiian kingdom, once stolen, can one day be reborn. The digital age has fundamentally rewritten the playbook for anyone with a claim to a crown, transforming what was once a quiet, diplomatic pursuit into a global media spectacle. Long gone are the days when a pretender's legitimacy was debated solely in aristocratic drawing rooms or through carefully worded pamphlets. Today, the battle for public opinion is waged on smartphone screens and through streaming services, where a compelling narrative can be more powerful than the most meticulously documented pedigree. This new media landscape is a double-edged sword, offering unprecedented tools to build a movement while also exposing claimants to a level of scrutiny their ancestors could never have imagined. Perhaps the most significant influence comes from the world of prestige television, with shows like The Crown acting as a massive, global public relations engine for modern royalty. While the series focuses on the British monarchy, its ripple effects are felt across the entire aristocratic world. By dramatizing the private lives and political struggles of the Windsor family, it has fostered a cultural obsession with royalty that spills over to all royal claimants. The show has educated a generation of viewers on the intricacies of succession laws, morganatic marriages, and the immense pressure of hereditary duty. This widespread literacy in dynastic affairs means that when a figure like Prince Karl Emmich of Leiningen announces his conversion to Orthodoxy, a segment of the public instantly understands the profound symbolic weight of that act, something that would have been lost on most people just a decade ago. However, this dramatization also creates a tricky environment. The Crown blends historical fact with artistic license, often prioritizing emotional truth over strict accuracy. This can cement certain narratives in the public consciousness, like the perpetual turmoil of the monarchy, which can then be projected onto all royal families, both reigning and in exile, shaping expectations and biases before a claimant even speaks a word. Beyond shaping perception, modern media provides the tools for claimants to bypass traditional gatekeepers entirely and craft their own image directly for the masses. Savvy descendants are no longer waiting for a sympathetic journalist to tell their story. They are becoming their own publishers. Social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter offer a powerful stage to perform royalty on a daily basis. A carefully curated feed can show a life of elegant purpose. A photo at a memorial service here, a shot of a family heirloom there, all presented with a caption that speaks of duty and legacy. This constant low-level presence helps to normalize their claim, making them feel less like a historical curiosity and more like a relevant public figure. It allows them to build a brand of modern, relatable nobility, one that might include philanthropic work, business ventures, and glimpses of family life, making the idea of their restoration seem less like a return to the past and more like a logical next step. This direct connection also allows them to respond to events in real time, issuing statements on national issues or correcting misinformation themselves, something the more reserved claimants of the past could never do. The documentary format has also been weaponized to stunning effect, moving beyond dry historical recounting to actively build a case for a specific claimant. The most famous example is the 2004 British program Britain's Real Monarch, which took the extraordinary step of not just exploring a historical theory, but of anointing its subject. By presenting a seemingly watertight genealogical argument and culminating in the coronation of an Australian farmer as the rightful king, the show didn't just report news, it created a claimant. It bestowed upon Michael Abnai Hastings a level of legitimacy and fame that would have taken decades to achieve through traditional means. This model has since been echoed by other aspirants who use documentary films and YouTube series to present their evidence, interview supportive historians, and frame their personal story as one of heroic dedication to a national cause. These productions serve as lengthy, compelling application letters for the job of monarch, distributed directly to the court of public opinion. Yet, for all its power, this new media strategy is fraught with peril. The same platforms that allow for image building also invite relentless scrutiny. Every post, every photograph can be dissected by armchair genealogists and hostile commentators. A claim that might have been debated by a few dozen specialists a century ago can now be picked apart by thousands of people online, with any inconsistency in the story or any perceived character flaw amplified into a major scandal. The need to maintain a constant, engaging presence can also backfire, risking the trivialization of the claim itself. If a potential king is also posting about his favorite brand of coffee or his holiday travels, he risks reducing his sacred cause to just another influencer feed, diluting the mystique and gravity that is so central to the idea of monarchy. The line between being accessible and being ordinary is a razor-thin one to walk. Ultimately, the digital arena has become the modern battlefield for legitimacy. Success is no longer just about having the right bloodline or the most persuasive legal argument. It is about winning the narrative. It requires the savvy of a social media manager, the production value of a filmmaker, and the thick skin of a politician. The claimants who thrive in this new environment understand that a crown in the 21st century is not just a symbol of authority. It is a brand to be built, a story to be sold, and a community to be cultivated online, one follower at a time. What unites the exiled king dreaming of his palace, the Gilded Age heiress writing a check for a crown, and the modern businessman discovered to have royal blood? It is the breathtaking power of a story. The allure of the royal claimant is a tale that has captivated humanity for centuries because it is the ultimate narrative of identity, destiny, and second chances. These are not just stories about politics or power. They are human dramas on a grand scale, filled with the raw ingredients of our most beloved myths: a hidden heir, a lost birthright, a treacherous usurper, and the audacious hope of reclaiming a stolen legacy. They tap into our deepest fantasies of discovering we are somehow special, that our ordinary lives are merely a prelude to a grander, more meaningful destiny. This is why the legend of Anastasia resonates so powerfully, why the tragedy of Bonnie Prince Charlie is immortalized in song, and why the story of an Australian farmer turned potential king can become a global sensation. We are drawn to the possibility that the established order might be overturned, that history might be rewritten, and that a single person, armed with nothing but their name and their conviction, can change the course of nations. Yet, beneath the romantic veneer of these stories lies a far more practical engine, the undeniable link between legacy and currency. A claim without funding is a whisper in the wind. From the Jacobite exiles dependent on the French crown to the Bonapartist pretenders bankrolled by American fortunes, every aspirant to a throne has needed a financial patron. The Gilded Age heiresses did not merely marry titles. They became the venture capitalists of royalty, investing their vast industrial fortunes in the most speculative of startups, a restored monarchy. Their wealth provided the oxygen that kept these claims alive, allowing pretenders to maintain the pageantry of a court in exile, lobby foreign governments, and project an image of viability. This transactional relationship reveals a cynical truth about power, that behind the divine right of kings often stands the very earthly power of a bank balance. It demonstrates that legitimacy is not merely inherited. It must be purchased, marketed, and sustained, blurring the lines between sacred bloodline and shrewd public relations. In our modern democratic world, the nature of these claims has undergone a profound transformation. The goal is rarely the restoration of absolute rule. It is the search for relevance. For most contemporary claimants, the ambition is not to command armies, but to serve as a symbolic anchor in a rapidly changing society. They offer themselves as non-political figures of unity, living reminders of a national history that predates modern political divisions. Their power is now soft power, the influence that comes from cultural patronage, diplomatic networking, and embodying tradition. Some, like Simon of Bulgaria, have even successfully transitioned from symbol to elected leader, proving that a royal brand, when repackaged as a promise of competent and uncorrupted leadership, can still hold immense sway with the public. Others, like Karl von Habsburg, leverage their heritage into global advocacy, transforming the concept of imperial duty into a mission to protect the world's cultural heritage. The throne they seek is not a seat of government, but a platform for influence. Ultimately, the persistent appeal of the royal claimant holds up a mirror to our own complex relationship with history and identity. These figures are more than just historical curiosities. They are living, breathing arguments about the past. Supporting a claimant is an act of choosing one version of history over another. It is a declaration that a particular bloodline, a specific legal interpretation, or a favored narrative is the true one. They force us to question what gives a person or an institution the right to lead. Is it divine mandate, the consent of the governed, the sheer force of tradition? Or is it, as it so often has been, the compelling nature of a well-told story? The quiet, enduring debates between Legitimists and Orléanists in France, or between the Heiresses and Patropolis branches in Brazil, are not merely family squabbles. They are philosophical battles over the principles of monarchy itself, fought with genealogical charts and historical documents instead of swords. The dream of the crown, it seems, is ultimately a dream of belonging to a story greater than oneself, to a lineage that stretches back through centuries, and to a sense of order in a chaotic world. The claimants and their supporters keep this dream alive, tending to the flame of a past that might still, they believe, illuminate the future. They remind us that history is never truly settled, that legitimacy is often in the eye of the beholder, and that the most enduring power of all is not always found on a throne, but in the unwavering human capacity to hope for a restoration, to believe in a righting of wrongs, and to imagine a world where a lost king can finally come home.